Hey everyone, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet,
At Astra, the podcast where we talk about the intersection between space, policy, and technology.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
I have a Master's of Public Policy degree with a concentration in Science and Space Policy.
And I'm a PhD in Computer Science and an all-around tech geek.
All right, guys, let's get this off real quick. It's pretty late on the night that we're recording, and let's get to work on this. So, Newton, what are we talking about this week?
So today, and latest from Washington, we'll be talking about the NASA Caucus update, Space Corps, the Deep Space Gateway, as well as NOAA getting an administrator nominee. In Space News Highlight of the Week, we're going to be talking about a well-deserved award to the folks who gave us the universe's baby picture. In international news, we're going to be talking about ESA pouring money into Vega E and a reusable spaceplane, as well as some news from JAXA about their participation in the Deep Space Gateway and some war games. And in latest in tech, we're going to be talking about the James Webb Space Telescope coming out of Chamber A. And then in listener-submitted queries, we'll be talking about a couple of follow-ons to last week's queries, where NASA approves SpaceX to fly a pre-flown rocket on the next Dragon mission, as well as some of NASA's safety standards. And in Coming Soon to Space, we'll be talking about some updates on the Mars Workshop wrap-up. So, Jack, latest in Washington.
All right, so we got a couple things going on here in Washington this week. So the first thing I wanted to say is that the reason we're recording so late is that I was attending the Achieving Mars workshop, which is the fifth in a series of annual workshops being put on by Explore Mars.
Okay, how do we achieve Mars?
Well, so all of the previous, all the AM1 through AM4 were all affording Mars. So it was all about the budget highlights of the Mars architectures. And today we got a brief glimpse as to what was covered in those four previous meetings over the last couple of years. And a lot of it deals with what architectures we can afford and which ones are our, I guess, Christmas list. And then right now, Achieving Mars is how do we now carry out the advocacy and the communications and public outreach side of things so that we can develop these architectures and build the missions that will send humans to Mars by the 2030s. So I have a little update on that later, but mainly we're going to be focusing on that next week. So coming out of Capitol Hill, Steve Knight, who's a Republican member from California, spoke at the Commercial Spaceflight Federation's November 30th breakfast. They had a get-together of a bunch of people from the commercial spaceflight industry to talk about, you guessed it, space. Mm-hmm. And Steve Knight was I wouldn't say MC, the capstone, the keynote speaker for the morning, and he specifically talked about the NASA Caucus. So this is something that we've been following, and we mentioned a couple weeks ago that Knight, Marcy Kaptur, which is a Democrat from Ohio, are leading this caucus, which now has 50 members, both Democrats and Republicans, with the express goal of advocating for NASA's budget, and its industry priorities, and how private industry can further the goals of the space agency. In his address, he talked a lot about how they don't have any legislative priorities set quite yet. Being a caucus, they generally will put out a recommendation letter or can send letters to their, dear colleague letters is what they're called, to other members saying, oh, we want to do this. Say this NASA caucus doesn't have any of the members or has a few of the members that are on the appropriations committee, but not everybody. This is a great way to show that there's cohesion across committees and across the entire Congress on specific issues. But the one thing that Steve Knight did mention is that there is general bipartisan support for Jim Bridenstine for the NASA administrator. I mean, although many Democrats will not come out and support Bridenstine, it is about time. And this is the longest that NASA has ever gone without an administrator. And Knight basically said, the time is now, let's get to work. And then after Bridenstine becomes administrator, we will be able to work on some major legislative issues, maybe even culminating in a new authorization act like we had last year for NASA. All of that is speculation, of course, but there's a lot of support for a 2033 human mission to Mars, robotic missions to the outer planets, and sort of what the future of the space agency looks like, especially with the retirement of some prominent people like Lamar Smith, who is the chairman of the science committee in the House. With him leaving, there's going to be a vacuum that has to be filled, and a lot of unanswered questions, as we've been talking about. And also, NASA has to be funded somehow, and with the continuing resolution hopefully wrapping up this week, I wish I could give some good news on that, but I don't know. Congress is only in session until Thursday this week, and
they're gonna wrap it up.
If we don't get an omnibus or a continuing resolution,
it's going to be a continuing resolution.
Yeah, no, it's most likely going to be a continuing resolution until next year, which means that we might have a 2017 budget, or technically it's a 2018 budget. So yeah, I guess it makes sense that the 2018 budget is passed in 2018, said no one in Congress ever. We're not preemptive about anything in Congress. But anyway. So that's some of the updates about the NASA Caucus. Newton, do you have any thoughts on the future of this cohesion of?
No updates here. All I remember hearing is that there were some folks that were slightly against the notion of the Mars mission in 2033, as far as the utility of that mission goes. But I mean, that is something that's going to continue being a battle going forward. I think that understanding why that needs to be a priority, it needs to be something that needs to be promoted by not only folks in the groups like the Planetary Society, but other representatives in Congress, as well as Bridenstine himself. I believe it's Steve Knight who was against the notion of a mission, or at least less interested in a mission to Mars in the 2030s time frame.
Yeah, I think more the concern necessarily isn't about, human missions to Mars would be really cool, and achieving that technological feat would be amazing. And I think Knight, as well as many Republicans, so the article that we have linked in the show notes mentions Representative Perlmutter from Colorado, who is finishing out his last term in Congress before retiring, has been a longtime advocate for this 2033 timeframe. Mm-hmm. And I think what Knight is more concerned about, and what a lot of us in the space community are concerned about, is that although 2033, send humans to Mars by 2033 is a great talking point, it's a great, newspaper headline, it doesn't bring home the bacon, right? It doesn't actually provide any policy solutions to that, which is in part what organizations like Explore Mars and the Planetary Society are trying to do, and especially with something like the Affording Mars Workshop, is develop out the architectures that could lead to, in 16 years, a mission to Mars. But again, it's all about less talking points, less newspaper headlines, and more real action on NASA-focused issues. So the next thing, another member of Congress that we all know and love, Mike Rogers from Alabama, not the Mike Rogers from Michigan. Mike Rogers, famous for his Space Corps amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which was also mentioned at the CSF breakfast, maybe not in such a highly regarded manner. But so Mike Rogers came out at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California this last week and said, we need akin to the Army Air Corps within the Army that eventually became the Air Force, and I guess the Marine Corps within the Navy, that is the Marine Corps, that we need a Space Corps, and that a Space Corps is inevitable, is the words that he used. Him and the ranking subcommittee chair person on the Democratic side, Jim Cooper of Tennessee, have both been longtime advocates for this Space Corps. And as you listeners know, me and Newton are not the biggest fans of Space Corps, but I would agree with him that
I'm not a fan of Space Corps right now.
Yeah, so that's. I think I agree with Rogers when he says that it's inevitable. I think eventually, unless barring some catastrophic happenstance, there will be a Space Corps, and eventually there will be a Space Force that we are going to require an entire department or an entire branch of service within the Department of Defense dedicated to space activities. I think it's going to be that important for the future of the species, both philosophically and economically, as well as security-wise. But in that same vein, I think that there also needs to be a much larger presence on the civilian side, and that's not being talked about, right? That everyone goes straight for defense, but doesn't talk about that, defense is only one part of the equation, and that civil space is, civil and commercial space, which depend not on the defense side of the federal government, but on the civil side of the federal government, is going to require more assistance. We talk all the time about, the FAA AST, the Office of Commercial Space Flight, only gets $17 million a year. There's a lot of desire for Space Corps, both civil and defense, to further develop our capabilities in space and the American hegemony, if you want to come at it from that way. So I agree with Mike Rogers. You will not hear me say that very often, but I agree with him in saying that the Space Corps is inevitable. I just don't think that his proposal of doing it by 2019 is feasible, workable, or even really that smart of an idea.
Well, I don't think it's useful to rush something like that.
Yeah, just to say that you have to have a Space Corps, just to say you have a Space Corps and say, all right, we checked off the box, we're all on our way to a vibrant space economy, that's just not how it's done. This needs to be very smart policy making and very focused development of this very fragile issue right now. Fragile. It's a very fragile economy. We talk about this all the time of how commercial space is not. It's not the automobile industry. It's not the airline industry. It's not like, a couple accidents and they're still fine. This is something that is still a volatile market, or maybe not volatile, but a very fragile market that if you rush too far into one side of the equation, it could cause it all to fall apart. But that's just me. And I guess the next thing, so two more, I'll make these ones really quick. But the Deep Space Gateway, our favorite future spacecraft, is going to be part of an updated exploration roadmap that NASA is putting together, supposedly going to be released next year. So if you remember in the NASA Authorization Act, there was a lot of talk about different reports that would be created, and one of those was a roadmap that would detail what needs to be completed before we send humans to Mars, humans to deep space. What are our milestones along this roadmap? And one of the leaks out of the International Space Exploration Coordination Group, which is developing this roadmap, is that NASA and a number of other international space agencies see the Deep Space Gateway as integral to this exploration roadmap, and that without it, we wouldn't be able to get. It's going to be the catalyst for deep space exploration, which we will get into that on the international side in international news. But for NASA specifically, and for us here in Washington dealing with policy, this is a very good step forward for NASA. Deep Space Gateway wasn't necessarily their idea. It was very much a top-down approach put on them by Congress. Talk of a Deep Space Gateway type station has been pretty long-standing, but Congress is the one pushing a lot of this forward, and to have NASA jumping on board with this plan and fitting it into their roadmap alongside all of the other million things that they're dealing with international agreements, with the ISS, with SLS, is very comforting to see that we're all starting to be on the same page, and that this roadmap will eventually be the blueprint that we will follow, the final architecture, if you will.
I doubt it's the final architecture.
I would agree with you that it will not be the final architecture, but it's like when you write a paper or like make a report on your computer and you're like, draft, final draft, final draft, final draft, the finally final draft. It's going to be sort of an iterative process, as space exploration tends to be, but this is going to be a very good first step towards developing human exploration beyond low Earth orbit.
I'll be very interested in seeing what falls to the right of that Deep Space Gateway on that roadmap.
Yeah, I just don't want it to be another squid map like the Journey to Mars one was, where it was the only the only thing that detailed NASA's plan for the journey to Mars was a poster, and it sort of was very vague. Okay, like here's the Earth and low Earth orbit, but then there's these tentacles that are going to the moon, but maybe not really. Maybe they're going to Mars. It was kind of a very difficult to read and very vague roadmap. So I will be very interested to see and read this report.
Yeah.
I will report the report when it is out. But yeah, so the final thing I wanted to bring up, and this is something that I guess is not necessarily entirely space related, but NASA's little brother, the national,
very space related.
It is. Okay. So NASA's little brother, NASA's little brother, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, they just got their nominee for administrator. So just like NASA, NOAA gets an administrator. NOAA, though, actually exists under the Department of Commerce, which NASA is an independent agency. But anyway, so NOAA, their nominee is this guy, Barry Myers, who, from all I can tell, is actually, so he was the chief executive officer at AccuWeather, which, if anyone has watched any sort of coverage of the weather phenomena in their life, you probably saw the name AccuWeather at some point in your life. And I think on most phones, it's the default weather app is the AccuWeather app.
Yeah.
I know on my phone it is too.
I think on most Samsung phones it is.
Yeah. The better brand. I'm going to start a war in the comments. But so Barry Myers, former executive officer at AccuWeather, was nominated just this last week, and he testified on last Wednesday about why he is a good choice to be administrator. And he basically came out and said that he thinks that climate change is the main cause of climate change is humans, and that he would support further science missions and understanding of our atmosphere and oceans and ecosystem to provide the best data possible to scientists, to provide the best data available to policymakers and government contractors, the lot, to make sure that science is taken seriously. So I included an article that goes a lot more in depth. Of course, I want to keep this short, but it goes a lot more in depth into his history at AccuWeather with the Weather Service, all that. But I think, like Bridenstine, I think even maybe more than Bridenstine, Myers is a great pick because he does actually work in the field and has a history working in climatology, or at least working with climatologists and atmospheric scientists. So that's something to watch. Again, like I said last week, I don't think we're getting a NASA administrator or a NOAA administrator anytime in the next month. I think it's going to be 2018 before we see an administrator of either organization. But it is good to see that even in this age of less than pro-science candidates for other positions, that we have people running our space agencies with a clear mind, or at least so they look.
Good enough.
In this climate, good enough is good enough.
Yeah. Take the W. To rehash an old episode.
Take the W, like our highest rated Ad Astra episode. I'm not actually sure if it's the highest rated. So actually rate this episode the highest to prove me wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
5 stars on iTunes, on Google Play, all of those.
Seriously, rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and iTunes so other people can find us, and we'll read your comments on the air.
Yes, we will.
So if that's it for latest from Washington, I think we'll move on to the space news highlight of the week. And as our highlight, the universe just won $3 million because of its baby picture.
How come I can't do that? I have some really cute baby pictures and some pretty funny ones too. I want $3 million.
Yeah, but the cosmic microwave background's cuter. I hate to say that to you, Jack.
But we're all made of star stuff.
Exactly. This kind of is your baby picture. Like, it's kind of all of ours.
It's all of it's all of our baby pictures. Anyway, continue.
Yeah. So the Breakthrough Prize, otherwise known as the Oscars of Science, is an opportunity for the community opportunity to highlight and award folks for some of the most significant research advances on the planet. It was started back in 2012 by tech investor Yuri Milner and backed by people like Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, Google's Sergey Brin, 23andMe co-founder and Wojcicki, and Tencent co-founder Pony Ma. This year, prizes went to researchers working in cell biology, neurobiology, plant biology, mathematics, and the reason it's being mentioned on this show, astrophysics. So the prizes are 7 $3 million awards and 6 $100,000 prizes for physicists and mathematicians early in their careers. And it gets presented at NASA Ames Research Center. And it actually occurred this past Sunday, that was December 3rd. They're the largest monetary prizes for fundamental scientific research. And unlike the roughly $1 million Nobel Prizes, this actually recognizes mathematicians as well, which is fantastic. And like one of the awardees, Charles Bennett, said, the point is not to make rock stars specifically of the scientists, but of the science itself, and highlight the science itself. So the 27-member team of astrophysicists behind the WMAP space telescope, which was used to map radiant heat left over from the Big Bang, otherwise known as the cosmic microwave background, that iconic green, yellowish with and black picture that basically highlights the leftover light from the Big Bang, actually won a prize. The team's 5 leaders were recognized: Charles Bennett from Johns Hopkins University, Gary Hinshaw from the University of British Columbia, and Norman Jarosik, Lehman Page, and David Spergel, all from Princeton University. So yeah, they took home the prize for the cosmic microwave background. I mean, I think it's great that there's a prize like this that really was spurred on by other folks in the sciences and technology background. It's great that people from that background are now at the place where we can award other people in that space, right? Because the Nobel Prize, while it's great, it's not necessarily completely funded or anything like that by folks who are scientists or technologists or engineers. Whereas this is an example of, billionaires like Zuckerberg or Sergey Brin actually giving back to the science community, which, without them, they wouldn't have been anywhere. So it's really interesting.
And it from a, I guess, not necessarily policy, but from like a U.S. perspective, a government perspective, seeing this stuff happen, utilizing in part technology developed by the U.S. government, this adds a bit of prestige, right? Like to say our scientists are the ones who got this award, even if it's, when it comes to the U.S. government, $3 million is chump change. That's spent on toilet paper every day basically, but it's the prestige around this and seeing the results of years and years worth of work culminate in looks like if you've never seen cosmic background radiation, it just kind of looks like a bunch of blue and green and red dots, but it's the science behind it and the understanding that we get from images like this sort of show us our place in space, and our understanding of the cosmos is expanded every time that this becomes a front page article in the local newspaper, at the New York Times or whatever it is. That this is, it's a matter of prestige. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a matter of prestige. I think the focus here from everything that I've read, though, and from even seeing the awards, though, is the appreciation for the science, which I'm way more interested in. It really highlights the fact that this was such an impactful thing. It's arguable to say that since probably since the early 20th century, there have been probably 2 concepts that have transformed the way astronomers think about observing the universe. The first being, figuring out how large the universe is, right? That it's fantastically large. So the portion of the universe visible today is a sphere nearly 15 billion light years in radius. And the second is the cosmic microwave background, the oldest light that we see. Being able to being able to demonstrate just how far that stretches and that it aligns with that, roughly with that 15 billion year radius. I mean, it has been extremely impactful to astrophysics moving into the 21st century. So I appreciate how much they appreciated that, and they clearly appreciated enough to give $3 million to this group of scientists, which is just fantastic. So yeah, props to the WMAP team. I'm hoping that money is well spent on those folks can basically go and enjoy their life, but I'm sure they're just going to go and do more science.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, moving on to international news, we're gonna get started with an article from ESA. The ESA just doled out about 89.7 million euros for a couple of new projects. So on Wednesday, the European Space Agency signed a contract with industry to continue the development of a small robotic autonomous space laboratory capable of launching and then returning smoothly to Earth. So ESA handed a giant check to start with for 36.7 million euros to the Italian Space Agency, which then doled out the money to the company Avio Spa and Thales Alenia Space, which we've talked about before as far as small businesses over in Europe, to continue the development of a small autonomous flying lab capable of returning, of launching and returning to Earth. The name of that ship is the Space Rider. Most of that money, about 60%, is actually provided by Italy, and France invested a good chunk of money into that as well. The project itself is a logical continuation of a previous project, which I don't think we reported on this before, but it's called the Intermediate Experimental Vehicle, and that was a small experimental shuttle without wings, and it was built by the same group, and they had the same concept, launching and then returning to Earth, although less smoothly because they didn't have wings. That project's colloquially called the IXV. But if the exterior design of this Space Rider is anything like the IXV, several significant changes have already been planned. The first will be that the shuttle will be equipped with a service module at the rear to power the experiments on board, but also to propel the craft periodically to keep it in its orbit. And that module will be an adaptation of the current fourth and last stage of the Vega rocket. ESA's specifications will stipulate that this small laboratory can remain for at least 2 months in orbit before returning to Earth. The second fundamental difference is precisely related to its return capability. When this new craft lands, the goal this time will be to land on the ground automatically with no manual flight controls or anything like that envisioned. So they have a pretty impressive form of their own shuttle, basically, which ESA, as far as we've known, has yet to really produce. America was well known for its shuttle. I mean, they've produced capsules and things like that over in ESA and over in Russia, but having a capability that for takeoff and smooth landing, along with spending 2 months in orbit, is quite impressive. So best of luck to ESA on that. They're also investing 53 million euros to prepare the future of the light launcher Vega, a new version of the Italian shuttle was announced recently, and it's called Vega C. It's a little heavier, and it's currently in the development phase. The funding would promote Vega C, as well as a more futuristic version known as Vega E. So they're pushing startup costs for both of those transports right now, and this is Europe, in a big way, pushing itself even further into space for things like in situ experimentation, something that can potentially replace experiments that they've been doing on ISA. Once ISA goes out the window, this will allow them to do things like conduct lab experiments in space, which is really neat.
So good on ESA.
Yeah.
So the next two topics are very related. And just to preface both of them, so Japan has a space agency, right? JAXA, that focuses, they launch satellites. They focus a lot on the scientific aspect and robotic exploration. But as with many countries, has a human exploration goal, sending humans to the moon, sending them to Mars, whatever it may be. So Japan right now is in the middle of where sort of, I guess, almost akin to where we in the U.S. were last year with developing, and still are, I guess, right now, with this roadmap of developing a roadmap for Japan's space policy priorities. And part of that includes bringing in the defense side of Japan's government. So the office in their defense ministry that deals with space is going to be joining the Schriever war game, which is a war game, a simulation of potential conflict in the future, set 10 years in the future of the year that the war game takes place. And it takes place in Colorado at the Schriever Air Force Base. And generally the second full week of December is the timing of this every year. Other countries that are involved include Germany, New Zealand, Canada, Britain, Australia, and a number of other countries that send their space forces or people from their defense ministries to Colorado to participate in this war game. What's, I guess, interesting about this is that this is coming off of an agreement between Shinzo Abe, who's the Prime Minister of Japan, and President Trump over expanding cooperation in space. So this is a direct result of some talks that have been happening over the last couple months between the U.S. and Japan, and shows that Japan is very interested in working alongside the U.S. And recognizes the growing need for multilateral support for defense space initiatives. Schriever Air Force Base in sort of central eastern Colorado is home to the 50th Space Wing, the 310th Space Wing. It's basically other than some other Air Force bases in Colorado, is basically the home of a lot of the space, what would it probably become the Space Corps, is Schriever Air Force Base. So this is I think the 10th year that they're doing the war game. No, it's the 11th year. This is the 11th war game, the Schriever war game. And so I just found it very interesting that Japan is tacking on to or joining this war game. At the same time, that is our next piece of news, that they are aiming to join NASA. So not just joining DoD in space, but joining NASA too in developing tools and a platform to launch from the Deep Space Gateway to the lunar surface. So as we've talked about a number of times before, our favorite future space station, the Deep Space Gateway, could be a branching off point for many international organizations to develop capabilities to land on the lunar surface. The Deep Space Gateway is not going to be very big, so it's what you can fit in it now. Granted, it might grow with time as the ISS did, but the current iteration of the Deep Space Gateway only allows for international partners and commercial enterprises to use it as a platform to go to the lunar surface. NASA has no interest in sending their astronauts to the lunar surface unless something changes policy-wise and the whole Mars roadmap to Mars changes. But yeah, so Japan is both interested in this defense aspect of space as well as the civilian side of space and sending their astronauts to the moon, which also in context is interesting that they are directly competing then with China, who has set out to land astronauts on the moon by the mid-2020s.
Yeah, but China's not looking at leveraging an existing craft, as far as we know.
That's true.
That could change.
Well, NASA is not allowed to work with China. So
it's not as of right now, but yeah.
I don't think that's going to change in the next 3 years, but so it's Japan is utilizing their relationship with the United States to push them further ahead than some of their rivals, their regional rivals in the in Asia. So it's interesting that both of these stories came out in about the same week, because there is this roadmap that's being developed in Japan and could pay a very good compliment, or be a very good compliment to the roadmap being developed by the U.S. and as ESA and the other various space agencies around the globe, and especially in developing places that don't have space agencies but are developing them, like New Zealand is in their first decade basically of having a space agency, as well as Australia, who is in their first year of having one, developing the relationships and the, I guess, where the lines are drawn between alliances in space exploration. Again, I have not seen anything about China's response to this, or if they even care too much that Japan's thinking of buddying up with the United States on the way to the moon. But it will be interesting to see if this could be a point of contention when it comes to international agreements, maybe with the ISS, with the Chinese space station, the Taigong, I think is the name of it, the Taigong 2 space station. So something interesting to keep in mind.
What are Japan's goals here as far as lunar exploration? What are they shooting for? Right? Because we kind of have some sense, at least we know that the Chinese have a sort of their own roadmap laid out, albeit, it's had there's been a few speed bumps on it, or ditches. But they have their own roadmap where they're trying to do lunar exploration, particularly over the next decade. What's Japan going for?
Well, I think part of it certainly has to do with that regional rivalry that they have with China, and in part also with Russia. Russia announced back in September that they were partnering with the United States on the Deep Space Gateway. And since then, we've seen a number of countries express interest in wanting to get on board. I mean, it's interesting to see that if, this was 20 years ago, when it was first announced that the ISS was going to involve the newly created Russian Federation and Roscosmos in the development of the ISS, a lot of these countries, Japan and ESA, well, I mean, ESA is not a country, but agency, were very apprehensive of including Russia. But because Russia is getting more involved and becoming a major player in space again, a lot of other countries say, hey, why can't I do that? This is, and again, then it kind of goes into the prestige aspect. I mean, if Japan is able to beat Russia or China or any of the other number of countries that they're competing with to the moon, to be the second country to land on the moon, that's a lot of national prestige. And for as small a country with as much to lose as Japan does, I think it's very high on their priority list, because they can branch off and develop these technologies to land on the lunar surface, utilizing their long found relationship with the United States. So I think it's both a wanting to collaborate with other countries and learn, the trade secrets, but also the rivalry with China, with Russia, and even maybe in part with the United States, trying to say, hey, you may not be committed to lunar exploration, but there's a lot of science that could be done on the lunar surface, and a lot of stones left unturned after the last boots from the Apollo program left in 1972.
Well, speaking of things that relate to the moon, things that are lunar, the James Webb Space Telescope just emerged from Chamber A last week. So last week, we discussed this, I want to say a few months ago on the podcast when it was submerged into Chamber A. But last week, the telescope was removed from the cryogenic testing chamber that it's been living in since July at NASA Johnson's Space Center in Houston. The telescope just finished up around 100 days of testing inside the chamber, where it was subjected to super cold temperatures to see if it was ready for the frigid conditions of space. And now JWST will soon be moved to California for another round of testing before the spacecraft's scheduled launch in 2019. So if you remember all the way back to the summer, before the tests actually began, it took a week to remove most of the air from the chamber and a month to cool the instruments to the required temperature for testing. That the program of tests coincided with Hurricane Harvey, which dropped more than 1 meter of rain on on much of the Houston area. And as you remember, we reported this as well. Despite the difficult conditions during the storm, the team managed to safeguard the entire testing infrastructure, and the testing was really not affected by Harvey at all. So we got lucky in that light. These tests included an important alignment check of Webb's 18 primary mirror segments to make sure all of the gold-plated hexagonal segments acted like a single monolithic mirror. That this was the first time the telescope's optics and its instruments were tested together, though those instruments had previously undergone cryogenic testing in a smaller chamber over at Goddard, which we've actually seen.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Like literally pretty cool.
I see what you did there. So yeah, for those of you who are like, what the hell are you talking about? What telescope are you talking about? JWST is soon gonna be the most powerful space telescope that has ever been built. And the idea of it is that this is the first telescope that we're going to have orbit 1 million miles from the Earth. And it's going to allow scientists to peer into some of the deepest recesses of the universe and help us learn about some of the first galaxies that ever formed. And with a primary mirror that's more than 6 times larger than that of even NASA Hubble Space Telescope, JWST, this telescope will have extremely high resolution, capable of studying the atmospheres of planets outside of our solar system. So, full stop, we'll be able to look at and analyze these exoplanets and, fingers crossed, find some of the first signs of life, or at least at least the conditions that help to form other planets and other systems, which helps us to understand how our planets formed within our system. Helps us understand more about us. So that's like I said, the next step is for JWST to move out to California. Its next stop is Redondo Beach. The Redondo Beach location of Northrop Grumman, the primary defense contractor that's been building JWST for NASA. The main mirror of JWST will be united with its sun shield, a very complex structure that's designed to keep the telescope from getting overheated. JWST is meant to observe in infrared light, which means it needs to operate at super cold temperatures to work properly. The sun shield is made up of thin layers of a material called Captain, which will expand and block out the intense heat from the sun. NASA expects the installation of the sun shield to be an incredibly complex process, which is one reason why they recently delayed the launch of the telescope from late 2018 to spring of 2019. That came out recently. But once JWST is united with its sun shield and a few more components are installed in the telescope, the spacecraft will be basically complete. That's when the observatory will undergo some additional testing at Northrop Grumman and then be shipped to French Guiana for its launch. So it's a very clear roadmap, as there has been for a while for JWST. It's just had some bumps in the road like the sun shield, but it is on its way. and we're going to be continuing to watch this because, not only is this, a few $1 billion of taxpayer money, this may be one of the most important. Well, it is one of the most important instruments we've ever built as a species. So,
yeah. I guess the word of the week is roadmap. So in the comments on Facebook, please give us your roadmap for human space exploration.
I like that. That'll be our question of the week.
Yeah, that'll be, you know what? I that's what I want. I want you, the listener. I don't care who you are, what your background is. You could know absolutely nothing about space, but I want your question about space policy roadmaps.
Maybe we'll link to a Reddit. Maybe we'll link to our Reddit.
Yeah, maybe
our subreddit.
So another thing is, I don't think we ever really announced this, but we do have a subreddit. I know this is, again, a tangent. I love when we go on tangents. But so we have a subreddit, @Astra Podcast, r/@Astra_podcast. And we've been posting some articles in there that we've written back and forth over the last 2 weeks. And I mean, we've been getting some good responses from them, but we want to hear from you, our listeners. What is your question about roadmaps? What is your question? It could be as simple as, do roadmaps even work? And we will research it and give you the answer.
So
But I wrote your question for you. It has to be a different question than that. Can't be that question.
I like that question. That might be a good question to start with.
It'll be our backup question. But yeah, so the next thing in tech, and I think going to be our sort of last thing for the night before we wrap up, is so Elon, our good friend of the show, great person all around, Elon Musk, made a great claim on Twitter. He was talking about the launch of Falcon Heavy, which is supposedly going to happen at the end of this month. The launch window is December 29th to the 31st, so New Year's Eve might go off with a bang. Let's hope not. let's hope it gets off the launch pad. But so
I
it's
hope
launching
everything goes well.
I do too. Well, so it's launching on pad 39A. Which is they just recently refurbished it after an accident there with SpaceX. But so this is the Apollo launch pad that they are launching the Falcon Heavy on. And Elon went to Twitter to talk about it. And sounds like a lot of people these days, right? And he says that the payload will be a midnight cherry Tesla Roadster, which is the Tesla sports car that was just released about a couple weeks ago, playing Space Oddity by David Bowie. The destination is Mars orbit, and it will be in deep space for 1 billion years or so if it doesn't blow up on ascent. So, let's put aside all of our reservations about this in terms of like planetary protection and just the lack of feasibility of keeping something in Mars orbit without thrusters or any sort of assist for 1 billion plus years.
That's some solid orbital dynamics.
That is
math that is so impressive.
Like, I don't even think Phobos or Deimos are going to be in Mars orbit for 1 billion years.
Yeah.
So I think when I first read it, I thought it was a complete joke. And I'm sure as you guys are listening to this, you're laughing like crazy, that you're laughing out loud. You're lolling, as the kids call it. But he is serious, I think, to a point. He talking to reporters after he made this tweet, he said, "I am completely serious. That is the payload." Whereas most companies, when they have their inaugural launch of a vehicle, like the Delta IV did this, the Atlas V, the Antares, they all do this, is they launch, like 2 tons of bricks, like nothing that's valuable that gets damaged, that isn't going to, if it lands on someone, maybe 2 tons of bricks is going to hurt, but you're not losing a $2 billion satellite or a probably $1 billion car, for as much work as they're putting into it. So it sounds like he's extremely serious about this, but I'm still very skeptical. I was talking to some folks today, and I would wager to say that he's going to keep up this charade up until like 2 days before launch, and they're going to pull the manifest. They're just going to be like, nah, it's just a concrete block that we're sending up. It's not actually the Tesla Roadster. And I think it's going to create, there's going to be like the social media hype. Oh, Elon's sending a car to Mars. It's going to be great. NASA's never done that. Little do they know about NASA's experiment with the 1998 Honda Civic. But I don't really think that Elon is going to be.
I think the one thing that Elon's very serious about is getting us to talk about Elon.
You know what? I said this today, and I said this to you before we even started recording, and I know people are going to ostracize me for this, but I will stand by it. Not politically or socially or even socially around women. Elon Musk is the Donald Trump of space. Takes to Twitter.
That's a bit much.
That's not what you said earlier. No, look at it. Takes to Twitter, outrageous claims, thinks he's that he's the universe and just wants people to talk about him and his endeavors, while turning a blind eye to some of his lesser good qualities, like blowing things up on historic launch pads. I would say it's a pretty fair characterization. That, I mean, he has a cult of personality around him.
Only in the sense of Twitter.
Yes.
When I say that
yes. Only in the sense of his, I guess, media strategy, that it's a very, I mean, it is very Twitter focused, but it's very like, I guess almost guerrilla warfare, like media strategy that kind of pops up every so often and has like a big bang and then kind of disappears for a little while. Granted, the person in the White House does not go away ever. But yeah, I would say Elon's just trying to stir up excitement for the big launch of Falcon Heavy, which is going to be amazing. But I don't think that they're actually going to be launching a Tesla Roadster. But you know what? If Elon wants to prove me wrong and wants to play Space Oddity for 1 billion years, I'll jam along to that.
I'm fine with it.
Ground control to Major Tom. We are almost done with this episode. I just wanted to point out, so we talked the last 2 weeks basically about this topic called assured access policy, which isn't, I guess, is sort of becoming a phrase. I haven't really seen it prior to this, but we talked about how NASA and the U.S. government aren't necessarily going to be investing directly in things like the big Falcon rocket, or what New Armstrong is the one that's after New Glenn for Blue Origin. They're not directly going to be investing in these major projects, but are going to utilize the technology where they can, and give companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and ULA the ability to make innovation on previously existing technology through government contracts. I mean, it's the old way of doing things. If you give them a government contract to do something and they take that technology and run and create a new product for a commercial market that earns them a couple $1 million every launch or every, couple years or whatever it is with the technology. So there's 2 articles in the show notes that I think everyone should read if you're still interested in this topic of assured access and government funded innovation in the space field. The first one is about NASA approving the next commercial cargo, the COTS program, if y'all remember that. So SpaceX is one of the contracted companies for that. They're going to be sending cargo to the International Space Station on a Dragon capsule, and they will be flying on a previously flown Falcon 9 first stage. So one of the, 6 so far? 5 or 6 previously flown Falcon 9 first stages. So that's interesting because in a few days later, that was published on November 30th, or November 29th was the announcement, November 30th, the Space News article. On December 4th, NASA put out some guidelines on safety requirements for the commercial crew program. So commercial cargo and commercial crew, 2 programs that the government is using to spur innovation within the commercial space sector. And some of these safety requirements are, making sure that you don't kill anybody in the launch of the vehicle. So it's interesting to see this sort of push and pull of government oversight over what they can have oversight over in commercial space activities. So not losing crew, but also innovating and creating new technologies that can further develop a commercial space economy and increase this assured access to space. So 2 great articles that you should read. If you have questions or want to talk about that, put it in the form of a question about roadmaps and send it to us. Yeah. Do you have anything for coming soon to space, or I've
got nothing.
So, as I mentioned earlier, these are my coming soon to space. I have 2 things I want to bring up. The first one is Newton will be absent next week for next week's episode of your favorite space policy podcast. And I will instead have a very special guest on to talk about the Achieving Mars workshop. So it's a 4-day workshop. Actually, technically, I think it's only 3 days. But today on Monday, there was a VR workshop, sort of the intersection between virtual and augmented reality and exploration of space, both missions to Mars, low Earth orbit, and even where there was some talk about how we train astronauts using VR. Really interesting discussions, but stuff that we will bring up on next week's episode in our recap of this Achieving Mars workshop, AM5, as they're calling it, with the 5th iteration of it, which wraps up this Thursday. So I will have some very good insights for you at the end of, or at the beginning of the episode next week. The other thing I wanted to bring up is if any of you listeners, I know there are so many of you, that there's got to be some of you who are in Alabama. And if you are like me, you were registered to vote way before the deadline. Actually, I was registered to vote, I think, when I voted in Michigan, but I was registered to vote like right when I turned 18. I was like ready to go, and I voted in like the municipal election that year. It was a very exciting time for me. But so there's an election in Alabama, and I'm only really bringing this up, well, one, because it's the only Senate election between now and November 4th or November 6th next year. But this is a very important election for a number of reasons, including space. I will not comment on the, I guess, other things going on in the Senate special election in Alabama, but I will say that to have a pro-science elected official from Alabama will be a great thing in the upcoming Congress, especially as we talk about things like the nomination of Jim Bridenstine, of Barry Meyer, of all these different major policy decisions that are going to happen in the next year even before the 2018 elections wrap up. To have a pro-science candidate in that position would be, I would say, very beneficial. So do your part and vote. I will not encourage you to vote for a specific person, but you should definitely vote for Doug Jones.
Yeah,
anyway,
seriously, don't vote for
please,
Roy Moore.
Please, honestly, if you vote for Roy Moore, I don't know if I want to speak to you ever again. Just it's kind of disgusting. Okay, that's enough of my little politics rant. You can listen to my other politics podcast if you really want to hear that. I don't actually run a politics podcast. Anyway, a lot of stuff, 10 articles. Yeah, actually, I think we brought more things up than 10 articles.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
But yeah, so we're getting close to an hour. It's bedtime for both of us. And I look forward to hearing about your trip abroad, Newton, when you come back. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their week, votes in the special election next week, and is ready for an awesome episode of Ad Astra next Wednesday. As always, I'm your host, Jack.
And I'm Newton.
Ad Astra.